One ordinary mechanic, $1 billion car, one secret that could get them both killed. On a cold Friday night outside Denver, a black Bentley rolled into a dying repair shop, and everything changed. The woman behind the wheel didn't offer her name. She handed over the keys like she owned the world, because she did. But what Ethan Brooks found underneath that car wasn't a mechanical failure. It was murder. Engineered, deliberate, patient murder, waiting for the right curve in the road. Someone wanted this woman dead, and now Ethan knew about it. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like and stay until the end. This one's worth it. The neon sign outside Brooks Auto and Repair had been flickering for 3 weeks. The B in Brooks stuttered on and off like it couldn't make up its mind, casting a pale orange pulse across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Ethan had been meaning to fix it. He'd been meaning to fix a lot of things. It was 11:47 on a Friday night, and he was still there. Most nights, Ethan was the last one to leave. Not because he loved the work, though some part of him still did, buried under the fatigue and the unpaid invoices and the slow grind of running a small business in a town where 3 bigger shops had opened in the last 2 years. He stayed late because the shop was quiet after everyone else went home. No phones ringing. No customers arguing about labor costs. No employee drama. Just the hiss of the compressor, the smell of motor oil and rust, and the particular peace that comes from a problem that has a solution. A real, physical, findable solution, if you just look hard enough. His daughter Maya was at her grandmother's for the weekend. That was the other reason he didn't rush home. The house felt too big without her in it. Ethan was 32, though most people guessed older. Not because he looked worn out, exactly. It was more the way he carried himself, with the kind of careful steadiness that gets built in a man who's had to be the only adult in the room for too long. He was average height, broad across the shoulders from years of physical work, with hands that were permanently stained at the knuckles no matter how many times he scrubbed them. His hair was dark and slightly too long, the kind of length that happens when a man keeps forgetting to get it cut. He had a small scar below his left eye from a bracket that snapped loose during a suspension job 4 years ago. Maya called it his battle mark. He called it a reminder to wear safety glasses. He was finishing up the paperwork on a 2019 Ford F-150 when he heard the tires. Not the usual slow crunch of gravel that meant someone was pulling into the lot by mistake, expecting a gas station or a fast food drive-thru. This was different, deliberate, controlled. The kind of approach that comes from someone who already knows exactly where they're going. Ethan looked up through the open bay door. The Bentley Continental GT came in slow, headlights cutting through the thin ground fog that had settled over the lot since sundown. It was black, not the kind of black you get off a standard paint job, but a deep, layered black that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The wheels were clean, the body panels were perfect. This was not a car that had been driving around Colorado in October, weather without care. Somebody loved this machine. It stopped at the edge of the lot, engine idling, and sat there for a moment. Ethan set down his clipboard and walked to the edge of the bay. He didn't go all the way out. Not yet. There was something about the way the car just sat there, running, that made him wait. Then the engine cut off. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was maybe 30, give or take. Dressed in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than Ethan's truck, heels that were completely wrong for a gravel parking lot, dark hair pulled back, not carefully, but in the distracted way of someone who'd been running their hands through it all day. She scanned the lot once, quickly, like she was checking something off a list, and then she walked toward him. No hesitation, no, "Excuse me, are you still open?" She walked like the question of whether he'd help her had already been decided. She held out the keys when she was still 5 feet away. "Fix it," she said. "I'll be back." Ethan looked at the keys, then at her. "Fix what, exactly?" "I don't know." She said it flatly, not like she was being difficult, but like she genuinely couldn't afford to explain further. "It drives wrong. Something's off. I need to know what." "Ma'am, it's almost midnight." "I know what time it is." He looked at the car, then back at her. "I can't promise I'll get to it tonight. I can put it in the bay, do a preliminary check, but a full diagnostic on a vehicle like that takes whatever it takes," she said. and she pressed the keys into his hand and walked away. He turned. "Where are you going?" She was already pulling out a phone, already walking toward the road. "I'll call an Uber." She didn't look back. "Take care of it." And then she was gone. Ethan stood in the middle of his parking lot at midnight, holding a set of Bentley keys, watching a woman in expensive shoes disappear into the dark. "Okay," he said to no one. He pulled the Bentley into Bay 2 and got the lift under it. That was the plan. Quick visual check, maybe run a diagnostic scan, leave a note, deal with it properly in the morning. That plan lasted about 4 minutes. The brake lines were the first thing that caught his eye, and not in a subtle way. When you work on vehicles long enough, you develop a visual vocabulary for what things are supposed to look like. Wear patterns, rust signatures, the particular geometry of components that have settled into their age. Ethan had been doing this since he was 17 years old, starting in his uncle's shop in Colorado Springs, learning the language of machines the slow and hands-on way. This didn't look like wear. This didn't look like age. He grabbed his flashlight and moved in closer. The rear brake line had been compromised at a section that sat behind a heat shield, a location that would be invisible during any standard inspection. The damage wasn't a cut exactly. It was more precise than that, a partial breach, engineered to weaken the line progressively under pressure, the kind of failure that wouldn't manifest immediately. The car would drive fine for days, maybe a week, until the driver was on a highway doing 75 miles an hour, pressed the brake pedal hard, and felt nothing. Ethan's hand went still on the flashlight. He stayed under the car for a long moment, thinking. Then he got up, walked to his workbench, and found a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. He put them on before he touched anything else. This wasn't the work of someone who got angry and took a wrench to a brake line. This was patient. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who understood how the failure would develop, who had access to the vehicle in a controlled environment. A garage, maybe, or a service center. Somewhere the car sat still long enough for someone to get under it without being noticed. He went back in. The more he looked, the worse it got. The front brake circuit showed signs of similar, earlier tampering. A different method, but the same deliberate intent. Whoever had done this had been methodical. They'd spread the damage across multiple systems in a way that made it look, at first glance, like coincidental wear. If Ethan hadn't known what to look for, if some other mechanic had done a routine check without real suspicion, they might have cleared the car, and then the woman would have died on a highway somewhere between Denver and wherever she was going. Ethan took photographs with his phone, a lot of them, every angle, every point of compromise, with the flashlight positioned to make the damage as visible as possible. He moved slowly and carefully because some part of his brain had already shifted into a different mode. Not mechanic mode, but something older, something from the 2 years he'd spent as a forensic engineering consultant before the shop, before Maya's mother left, before everything got simplified by necessity. He cataloged everything. He documented everything. He was so focused on the brake systems that it took him another 20 minutes to find the other thing. It was tucked behind the rear seat panel on the driver's side, in the narrow gap between the panel and the door frame, the kind of space that exists in most luxury vehicles and that almost no one ever looks into. Ethan found it by accident, running his hand along the interior trim looking for any sign of tampering with the vehicle's electronics. His fingers touched the edge of something. He worked it out carefully. A matte black USB drive, no brand markings, and a sealed white envelope. Not standard office envelope paper. Heavier than that, the kind used for legal documents. The seal was intact. He held both items in his gloved hand for a moment. He knew, on some level, that this was the point where a sensible man would put both items in a bag, lock up the car, and call it a night. Let the woman come back, hand her the evidence, tell her to call the police, and go home. None of this was his problem. He hadn't asked for any of it. He went and got his laptop. He told himself it was because he needed to understand what he was dealing with before he could know how to handle it, which was true. He told himself a mechanic's job sometimes included understanding context, which was also, loosely, true. He didn't tell himself the other reason, which was simpler. He was already in it. The moment he put on those gloves, he was already in it. He plugged in the USB drive. It wasn't encrypted, which surprised him. The contents were organized in folders with date-stamped names going back about 14 months. Inside each folder, scanned documents, spreadsheet files, and strings of emails exported as PDFs. The subject lines told him enough. Q3 fund transfer, Cayman account, revised corporate structure, confidential, board authorization, signature required. He opened one email chain. It was dense. Financial language layered over corporate language layered over what was clearly, if you read carefully enough, a set of instructions for routing money in a way that was designed not to be followed. Multiple entities, multiple jurisdictions. The kind of architecture you build when you need distance between the source of money and where it ends up. Ethan was not a financial investigator, but he'd grown up watching his uncle get defrauded by a business partner, and he'd spent enough time in depositions and forensic engineering proceedings to understand when someone was reading a document designed to obscure rather than clarify. He spent 40 minutes going through what he could access. He didn't understand everything. He understood enough. He put the USB drive down and opened the envelope. Inside were 3 sheets of paper. The first was a corporate org chart, hand-annotated in red ink, with a name circled near the top of the CFO chain. The second was a printed email, a single exchange between 2 email addresses that had been redacted except for the domain suffixes, discussing a timeline and a vehicle solution. The third was a photograph, a parking garage taken from a distance, a black Bentley, a man crouching near the rear wheel well. Ethan's stomach turned over. He sat back in his chair and looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he took out his phone and called the only person he could think of who would understand what he was looking at. Raymond Kowalski was 58, retired from the Denver field office of a federal investigative agency, and deeply involved in what he described as an ongoing war against my daughter's attempts to make me eat more vegetables. He and Ethan had met 6 years ago during a deposition in a product liability case involving a commercial fleet vehicle. They'd stayed in touch, not closely, but the way men stay in touch when they respect each other without needing to talk about it. A coffee here. A phone call after a news story about a case they'd both been peripherally connected to. Ray picked up on the third ring. "It's 11:58 on a Friday," he said, instead of hello. "I know," Ethan said. "I need you to tell me I'm overreacting." A pause. "What are you looking at?" Ethan told him. "Not everything. Not the USB contents, not the photograph, not yet. Just the breaks, just the method." He described what he'd found and how, and Ray let him talk without interrupting, which was one of the things Ethan had always respected about the man. When he finished, Ray was quiet for 4 seconds. "That's not overreacting," he said. "The precision of it," Ethan said. "This isn't rage damage, Ray. This isn't a jealous ex with a tool set. This is engineered." "Agreed. Who's the vehicle registered to?" "I don't know yet. She just handed me the keys." "She. You have a name?" "She didn't give one." Another pause, longer this time. "Ethan, do me a favor. Take photographs of everything. Don't touch the compromised components more than you already have. And don't be alone with that car longer than you have to be." "I already have the photos." Ethan glanced at the USB drive on the bench. "There's other stuff, Ray. Documents. On a drive that was hidden in the car." The silence on the other end changed quality. "Hidden how?" "Deliberately, behind a panel." "Is this person hiding evidence in their own vehicle, or—" "I don't know," Ethan said. "I genuinely don't know." Ray exhaled slowly. "I'm going to get dressed," he said. "Don't touch anything else. I'll be there in 35 minutes. He made it in 28. Ray arrived with coffee he'd stopped to get from the only 24-hour drive-through near his house, which told Ethan something about the man's habits. He walked into the bay, handed over one of the cups without comment, and went straight to the car. For the next 15 minutes, Ray examined what Ethan had documented. He didn't say much. He crouched low, angled his own flashlight, clicked his tongue once at the brake line, and took several photos on his own phone. Then he stood up, dusted off his knees, and took the coffee Ethan was holding out to him. "This is professional work," Ray said. "That's what I thought. Not hired hand professional, specifically trained. Whoever did this understood the failure mechanics of the hydraulic circuit at an engineering level." He sipped his coffee. "This isn't a guy who watched a YouTube video." "No, Ray looked at the USB drive on the bench. May I? Ethan nodded. Ray went through the drive more methodically than Ethan had, and he took longer. Ethan sat on the workbench and drank his coffee and let him work. At one point, Ray pulled up the spreadsheet files and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. These are shell company ledgers, he said. I figured that much. Not amateur shell companies. These have been constructed with real care. Ray was quiet for a moment. Someone was building a case. These documents weren't stored in this car by accident, Ethan. Somebody was keeping them somewhere they thought was safe. He looked up. Who is this woman? I told you I don't... The car registration, Ray said patiently. Pull up the VIN, run it. Ethan should have thought of that. He pulled up the registration database on the shop's terminal and entered the Bentley's VIN. The registered owner came back as a corporate entity. Sinclair Automotive Holdings, LLC, Denver, CO. Ethan and Ray looked at each other. Sinclair, Ray said. Ethan typed the name into his browser. Victoria Sinclair, age 30, CEO of Sinclair Automotive Group, one of the larger privately held automotive parts and manufacturing companies in the Mountain West region. She had taken over from her father, Gerald Sinclair, 18 months ago, following his death from a cardiac event. She had a degree from MIT, had worked in the company's operations division for 4 years before inheriting the role, and had, according to a Denver Business Journal profile from 8 months ago, surprised skeptics with a steady hand in her first year of leadership. There was a photo. It was the woman who had handed him the keys. Ray read the article over Ethan's shoulder. She inherited from her father. 18 months ago. And someone has been building a financial structure designed to route funds away from her company for at least 14 months. Ray set down his coffee cup. That timeline. I know. Someone started planning this almost immediately after she took over. They both sat with that for a moment. She's not just a target, Ethan said. She's the target. This is a corporate takeover operation. Ray nodded slowly, with a murder as the contingency plan. The shop felt very quiet after that. Outside, the flickering bee in the sign kept stuttering its uncertain pulse. The compressor ticked. Somewhere down the road, a truck passed on the highway. What do we do? Ethan asked. Ray looked at him. We wait for her to come back, he said, and you let me do the talking first. Victoria Sinclair came back at 6:14 in the morning. She walked in through the side door. Ethan had left it unlocked, and stopped when she saw Ray sitting in the plastic chair by the front desk, coffee in hand, looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting and is not surprised by what he's waiting for. Who are you? She said. Raymond Kowalski, he said. Former federal investigator, currently retired. Please sit down. She didn't sit down. She looked at Ethan, who was standing by Bay 2, and then at the Bentley, which was still on the lift. What's going on? Her voice was careful. Not panicked. Careful. Ms. Sinclair, Ethan said, I need to show you something. He walked her through it, all of it, the brake lines, the photographs, the USB drive, the envelope. He laid everything out on the work table he'd cleaned off and covered with a drop cloth. The printed photographs he'd taken, the laptop open to the drive's contents, the envelope's 3 pages arranged in a row. Victoria stood at the table and looked at everything without speaking for a long time. Her face, Ethan noticed, was doing a complicated thing. There was no shock, or if there had been shock, it had happened somewhere else, at some earlier point. And what was left now was something harder and more controlled. She was processing. And underneath the processing, if you looked carefully, there was something that might have been relief. The strange, terrible relief of having your worst suspicion confirmed. The photograph, she said finally. She was looking at the parking garage image. Do you recognize the man? She picked it up carefully by the edge, looked at it for a long time. The build is right, she said quietly, and that's our corporate parking structure. Second level. She set it down. I can't see his face. Do you know who took the photograph? She hesitated. My father's personal assistant, Charlotte Keyes. She sent me a package 3 weeks ago, documents and a drive. She looked at Ethan. I didn't put them in the car. I kept moving them.
I didn't want them at the office. I didn't want them at home. Her jaw tightened slightly. I put them behind that panel myself 2 days ago. I thought it was temporary. Why didn't you go to the police? Ray asked. Not accusatory, just direct. Victoria looked at him. Because I don't know who I can trust yet. A beat. And because the man in that photograph might be Marcus Hale. Ethan and Ray exchanged a glance. You're CFO, Ethan said. Yes. The word sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. He's been with the company for 11 years, Victoria said. Her voice had gone very flat. My father trusted him completely. He was at the funeral. He gave a speech. She was quiet for a moment. He sent me flowers on my first day as CEO. Nobody said anything. Tell me what you need from me, she said then, and her voice had changed again. Steadier, harder, resolved. Whatever processing she'd been doing was complete. What do we do next? Ray uncapped his pen. We start from the beginning, he said, and we build a case that holds.
They worked through the morning. Ray had a system built from 3 decades of investigative work for sorting evidence into what could be corroborated and what was circumstantial. He took the USB drive contents and began building a timeline, each document, each financial transaction, each communication, organized by date and tagged with a preliminary note about its evidentiary value. Victoria worked alongside him on the financial records. This was her territory more than anyone's. She understood the corporate structure from the inside, knew which entities were legitimate subsidiaries and which had been created in the last 14 months, and had no operational history beyond receiving and forwarding funds. This one, she said at one point, pointing to an entry on a spreadsheet, Calder West Logistics. That's not a real company. I've never seen that name in any of our operational records. Do you have access to the company's corporate filing records? Ray asked. Not from here, but I can get them. She looked at her phone. Charlotte has access to the archive. I need to call her carefully. I don't know if her line is being monitored. Use my phone, Ethan said. He held it out. Different number. Less likely to be flagged if someone's running a surveillance protocol on your contacts. She took it without hesitation, which told him something about how her mind worked. She didn't spend time on the gesture, the offer, whether it was appropriate. She identified it as useful and used it. Good. Ethan, meanwhile, worked on the engineering side. He prepared a formal forensic documentation report of the brake system compromise, the kind of document that would hold up in a legal proceeding. He'd written similar reports during his consulting years, though usually for product liability cases rather than anything like this. He was careful, precise, and thorough. He noted every point of compromise, described the methodology and technical language that was specific enough to establish expert credibility, and included reference to industry standards that made clear the deviation from any possible accidental failure pattern. It took 3 hours to get it right. Around 9 in the morning, Charlotte Keyes emailed a set of corporate filing documents to an address Victoria gave her, using a personal email chain Charlotte had apparently established specifically for secure communication. The woman had been careful. Whatever she suspected, she'd been building a paper trail the right way. The filings confirmed what the USB drive suggested. 6 shell entities, incorporated in Nevada and Delaware over a 14-month period, all linked through a web of managing member designations that pointed, with enough work, back to a single originating source. The work was sophisticated, but it had been done quickly, faster than the person who built it probably thought it would ever need to withstand scrutiny. He didn't think anyone would look, Victoria said. She was reading the filing printouts with a pen in her hand, making marks, cross-referencing against the spreadsheet entries. He thought by the time anyone had cause to look, he would already be in control of the company. She made a mark. Or I'd be dead. It was the first time she'd said it out loud, and she said it the same way she might note a figure in a ledger, clinical, a fact to be processed. Ethan looked at her. She didn't look back. She was already on the next document. By 11 in the morning, they had enough. What's the board meeting situation? Ray asked. There's an emergency session Monday morning, Victoria said. Marcus called it 2 days ago, which is... She paused. Now I understand why the timing mattered. He wanted me in that room before I had time to find out what was actually happening. He needed the vote while he still held the advantage, Ray said. Yes. Can you request a delay? If I request a delay without explanation, it confirms to him that I know something. It may accelerate whatever secondary plans he has. She looked at Ray directly. I need to walk into that meeting. I need to let him make his move, and then I need to take the room apart. Ray studied her for a moment. That's a high-risk approach. I know. If he's desperate enough to have your brake lines cut, he's dangerous enough to have other moves in play. I know that too. She didn't flinch, but walking away now means he wins by default, and everything he's built, every false document, every forged authorization, stays in place. She looked at Ethan. Your forensic report. How solid is it? It'll hold, Ethan said. And the financial documentation? It's there, Ray said. It's not perfectly assembled yet, but it's there, and it's real. If the right people see it, then I need the right people to see it before Monday morning, Victoria said. She stood up from the table, rolled her shoulders, and looked at both of them with an expression that Ethan would remember for a long time. Not cold exactly, but resolved in a way that had been forged by something, some time, long before this weekend. I need to make some calls, she said, from your phone, if that's still okay. Ethan handed it over. What Ethan hadn't expected at any point in that long Friday night and grinding Saturday morning was that he would feel useful in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Not the everyday usefulness of fixing a car, or solving a diagnostic puzzle, or explaining to a customer why their transmission needed more than just a fluid change. Something bigger than that. The feeling of being in the right place with the right skills at the right moment, which is something that happens rarely enough that most people forget what it feels like. He fixed a pot of coffee in the small back office. The machine was old and made coffee that tasted like it was angry about being made, but it was hot. And he thought about Maya at his mother's house, probably eating pancakes right now, probably showing his mother some drawings she'd done, probably fine. She was always fine. She was a resilient kid. She got it from her mother, who had been nothing if not resilient, even if the marriage hadn't been. He thought about the 2 years he'd spent doing forensic consulting before the shop. He'd been good at it. Not exceptional. There were better forensic engineers than him, people with more credentials and sharper academic backgrounds. But he'd been good, and he'd been honest. And honest mattered in that work because you were often the only person in the room who wasn't trying to win something. He'd walked away from consulting because Maya was 2 years old and her mother was leaving and someone had to be the constant. The shop had been his uncle's. He'd taken it over when his uncle retired because it was there and it was paid for and it was something he could do. He hadn't thought of it as giving something up. He'd thought of it as being sensible. Standing in his back office, listening to Victoria Sinclair make phone calls in a voice too quiet to hear clearly, listening to Ray organize documents at the workbench with the precise movements of a man who has done this kind of work long enough that it becomes automatic, Ethan thought that maybe being sensible wasn't the whole story. Maybe the right moment finds you when it needs to. He took the coffees out. Victoria was on the third call. She took hers with a nod, kept talking. Ray took his, studied Ethan for a second. You okay? Ray asked. I'm okay, Ethan said. Ray nodded, like that was enough. She's calling someone at the federal level, he said quietly. Corporate Fraud Division. She has a contact. Good. It's going to be a long weekend. Ethan looked at the Bentley on the lift, at the documents spread across the work table, at the thin gray October light coming through the bay windows. Yeah, he said. His shop, his lift, his tools. A woman whose brakes someone had cut, working 3 phones at once to save a company her father had built, while a retired federal investigator organized the evidence that would bring down the people who tried to take it from her. Outside, the B in the sign was still flickering. He'd fix that too. But not today. Victoria was still on the phone when Ray pulled Ethan aside near the back office door, speaking low enough that his voice didn't carry. She's talking to Daniel Reyes, Ray said. Federal Corporate Fraud Division. I know him, not well, but I know him. He's solid. If she can get him moving before Monday, we have a real shot at having federal eyes in that boardroom. Can she? Ethan asked. Depends on what she tells him and how much he believes it over a weekend phone call. Ray glanced back toward Victoria, who was pacing the length of the workbench with the phone pressed hard against her ear, her free hand moving in tight gestures like she was physically assembling the argument as she spoke. She's persuasive. She's also not wrong. Those are usually the two things that matter. Ethan watched her for a moment. There was something about the way she argued, not loud, not emotional, but with a particular density of conviction that made you feel the weight of every word. Like she'd stripped everything unnecessary out of her communication a long time ago because she'd learned it slowed her down. "She's been carrying this alone for a while," Ethan said. Ray nodded. "Probably since Charlotte Keyes sent her that package. Maybe longer." He looked at Ethan sideways. "That's a particular kind of tired. You know the kind." Ethan didn't answer, but he did know the kind. Victoria ended the call and turned around. Her expression was the closed, careful look of someone who'd just had a conversation that went okay, but not perfectly. "Reyes wants the documentation," she said. "Everything. He's not going to formally open anything over the weekend. He can't, procedurally, but he's willing to review the materials and have a conversation Monday morning before the board meeting." She set the phone on the workbench. "Which means we have roughly 40 hours to build something he can't walk away from." 40 hours is workable," Ray said. "Is it?" She looked at him directly. "Because what I'm about to tell you is going to complicate the timeline." She picked up the corporate filing printouts from the table and held up the sheet with the 6 shell entities. "I found something in the third entity, Calder West. There's a managing member listed I don't recognize, Richard Farrow. I ran the name through our company database. He's not in our records, but he is listed as a signatory on an internal authorization document from 14 months ago, a document that should have required my father's signature, not a third-party contractor's." She paused. "My father was already sick when that document was signed. He was in his last 3 months. He would not have been reviewing authorization paperwork carefully." The shop went quiet. "Someone used your father's diminished capacity to push through authorizations he wouldn't have approved if he'd been well," Ray said. "It wasn't a question. That's what it looks like." Her voice stayed flat, but something tightened around her eyes. "Which means this started before I even took over. Marcus wasn't reacting to me becoming CEO. He was already in motion. My father dying just accelerated the timeline." Ray sat down slowly on the edge of the workbench. "That changes the scope." "Yes," Victoria said. "It does." Ethan had been listening quietly, but now he said, "What does it change specifically?" Ray looked at him. "If the conspiracy began while her father was still alive, that means the forged authorizations might include her father's signature on documents he never actually reviewed. That's not just corporate fraud. That potentially implicates a criminal exploitation of a dying man's legal capacity." He let that sit. "That's a harder charge to build, but it's also a much harder charge to defend against. It makes the whole operation look worse. Jurors don't like people who steal from dying men." Victoria set the papers down carefully, like she was being deliberate about it, like she was choosing not to throw them. "My father built that company over 30 years, she said. "He started it with his brother in a rented warehouse in Commerce City. He worked Saturdays until I was 12 years old. He missed things he shouldn't have missed, and he knew it, and he worked harder to make up for it in ways that weren't always the right ways." She stopped. "He trusted Marcus Hale with the operational finances for 11 years because he believed in loyalty when it was offered to him. He was wrong about that." Nobody said anything for a moment. "He wasn't stupid," she said, and there was a defensiveness in it that was clearly old, worn smooth by years of having that particular argument with herself. He trusted the wrong person for too long." "That's not stupidity," Ethan said quietly. "That's just being human." She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted slightly. Not softened, exactly, but acknowledged. Like he'd said a thing she'd heard before but hadn't quite believed until this particular repetition of it, in this particular context. "Right," she said. Then she turned back to Ray. "What do we need to build this out properly?" Ray uncapped his pen again. "We need the original authorization documents with your father's signature, the real ones, from a period when he was clearly in good health, for comparison purposes. We need the forged or improperly obtained authorizations. We need to establish the chain of custody for the Calder West filings. And we need someone at the corporate level who can testify that Marcus Hale had exclusive access to the authorization workflow during the period your father was declining. He looked up. Does Charlotte Keyes know the internal process well enough to speak to that? Charlotte was my father's personal assistant for 9 years, Victoria said. She knows the internal process better than Marcus does. A pause. She was also the one who sent me the package. She already knows she's in this. Can she get here? Victoria picked up Ethan's phone again. I'll call her. Charlotte Keyes arrived 2 hours later in a 12-year-old Honda Civic that had a cracked front bumper and a University of Colorado parking sticker from 6 years ago still on the rear window. She was 54, small, and precise in her movements, with the particular manner of someone who'd spent decades making difficult people's lives run smoothly and had learned to be unobtrusive as a survival skill. She walked into the shop carrying a leather document bag that was clearly heavy and looked at Ethan first, then Ray, then Victoria. You found people, Charlotte said. I found people, Victoria confirmed. Charlotte set the document bag on the workbench without ceremony. Good, because I've been sitting on this for 6 weeks waiting to find out who I was supposed to hand it to. She unzipped the bag. I pulled everything I could access without triggering the document management system's audit log. Some of it I photographed on my personal phone. Some of it I printed during a period when the IT monitoring was down for maintenance. She began laying items out. Folders, USB drives, a legal pad covered in handwritten notes. I know that's not perfectly clean, but I needed a record before anything else disappeared. Ray was already looking at the folders. Disappeared. Has documentation gone missing? Charlotte looked at him steadily. 3 weeks ago, a folder of original authorization records from 18 months ago was removed from the physical archive in the CFO suite. The removal was logged as a records transfer. The receiving department has no record of it arriving. She paused. I know, because I checked. Carefully. Marcus moved the paper trail, Ethan said. Someone did, Charlotte said, with the careful precision of someone who had learned not to make claims she couldn't yet fully support. The timing aligns with Marcus Hale's schedule. He had sole access to the CFO suite that week, but I can't prove he personally handled the archive. Ray picked up the legal pad and read the first page of Charlotte's handwritten notes. His expression didn't change, but he turned to a second page quickly, which told Ethan something. Ray was not a man who moved quickly when he didn't need to. These communication logs, Ray said. You track the internal messaging system? The company uses an internal platform for executive communications. I had administrative access through my role as executive assistant. I'm not sure I was supposed to retain access after the leadership transition, but no one revoked it. Charlotte said this without apology. I documented the exchanges I thought were relevant. Do any of them reference the brake system modification directly? Charlotte hesitated. Not directly. There's an exchange from 6 weeks ago between Marcus Hale and an external contact. The platform shows the recipient's address only as an internal relay code, which is unusual. The message itself discusses a vehicle assessment protocol in a context that doesn't match any company operation I can identify. She found the relevant folder and handed it to Ray. Read the third exchange in that chain. Ray read it. He didn't make a sound, but he put the folder down slowly and looked at Victoria. Victoria had already read it, clearly. The tight quality around her jaw said so. Vehicle assessment protocol, Ray repeated, and the follow-up message uses the phrase delivery timeline confirmed. Yes, Charlotte said. When was this exchange? 7 weeks ago. 3 weeks before her brakes were modified, Ethan said. The four of them sat with that for a moment. The shop was very quiet except for the intermittent tick of the cooling compressor, and faintly, the highway sound from the road a quarter-mile north. It was now past noon on Saturday, the October light thin and cool through the bay windows, and all of them were running on bad coffee and the particular alertness of people who have been awake too long doing something that genuinely matters. Charlotte was the one who broke the silence. She looked at Ethan in a direct way that reminded him, oddly, of a schoolteacher he'd had in 9th grade, someone who evaluated you honestly and didn't pretend the evaluation was warmer than it was. You're the mechanic? Yeah. You found all this by accident? She handed me the keys, he said simply. Charlotte considered him for a moment, then looked at Victoria. He's writing the forensic report? Already written, Ethan said. Charlotte nodded like she was revising a preliminary judgment. All right, she said. She turned back to the table. Then let's get to work. The afternoon moved the way that kind of afternoon moves, with the grinding, unsexy momentum of people building something real. Not dramatic, not particularly comfortable. Charlotte and Ray worked through her document collection with a methodical thoroughness that Ethan found almost calming to watch. They cross-referenced dates, matched communication records against financial transaction logs, flagged discrepancies, and slowly constructed a narrative that was supported at each point by something tangible rather than inference. Victoria worked separately, at the back office desk with a laptop she'd had Charlotte bring, pulling together the corporate financial records she had access to as CEO. She was cross-checking the shell entity structures against the company's legitimate operational accounts, building a map of how money had been moved, small amounts at first, transferred in ways that might have appeared to be routine operational expenses, then larger amounts routed through the shell companies toward accounts that had no operational justification. At one point, she called Ethan over. "Look at this," she said. She had a spreadsheet open, and she'd highlighted a row of transactions from 11 months ago. "These are marked as vendor payments, equipment supply contracts. You see the amounts?" He looked. "Yeah. The vendor names don't match any of our approved supplier list, and the payment amounts are... Look at the pattern." She scrolled down. "They increase each quarter by almost exactly 18%. That's not random. That's an escalation formula. Someone built this to grow." "He was planning to stay in place long term," Ethan said. "He was planning to be CFO of this company for another 20 years, Victoria said, skimming at an escalating rate with the operation structured to look like legitimate vendor activity. She paused. Until he decided he wanted more than the skim, he wanted the whole thing. She closed the spreadsheet and was quiet for a moment. "I don't even think it's about the money anymore. Not entirely. I think he looked at me taking over and decided a 30-year-old woman with 18 months of tenure was easier to remove than my father." A beat. "He might have been right about that if I hadn't driven into your parking lot." Ethan didn't say anything to that. He wasn't sure what the right thing to say was. He went back to his workbench and added a supplemental section to the forensic report covering the timeline established by Charlotte's communication logs, noting the correlation between the delivery timeline confirmed message and the subsequent brake system modification. Around 4 in the afternoon, Ray's phone rang. He walked away from the table and talked for 6 minutes in a voice too low to follow. When he came back, he had a look Ethan recognized from the years of deposition work. Not excitement, because Ray Kowalski didn't do excitement, but a particular form of focused engagement that was the older man's equivalent of it. "That was an old contact at the Denver field office," Ray said. "Not Reyes, someone else. I described the situation without naming anyone. Hypothetically." He put his phone in his pocket. "She told me that there's been an open inquiry at the federal level into financial irregularities at a Mountain West Automotive Corporation for the past 4 months. She didn't name the company. She didn't need to." Victoria set down her pen. "They already knew. They had the thread," Ray said. "They didn't have the full picture. What we have here," he gestured at the table, the documents, the organized reconstruction of 4 months of methodical case building, this is the rest of the picture. "Will Reyes move on it before Monday?" Victoria asked. "I think Monday morning becomes very interesting," Ray said carefully. "I think when you walk into that boardroom, you won't be walking in alone." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "But I'll be walking in first." "Yes," Ray said. "You will." She nodded once like that was fine, like she'd expected exactly that and had already made her peace with it. "Then I need to know what Marcus has on me. Whatever he's planning to present to the board, whatever forged misconduct case he's built, I need to see it first." "That's harder," Ray said. "Charlotte," Victoria said. Charlotte had been listening. "I can access the board meeting preparation documents," she said. "The CFO submits a briefing packet to the board secretary 48 hours before a special session. That was yesterday." She looked at her watch. "The board secretary is Ellison Park. He stores those documents on the corporate server under a restricted access folder. A pause. My administrative access should still cover document retrieval from board preparation files. Should? Ray said. Marcus may have had my access modified, Charlotte said. He knows I sent Victoria the initial package. He doesn't know what I've done since then, but he's not careless. She pulled out her personal laptop. Only one way to find out. She typed for about 3 minutes. Her expression didn't change much, but at one point she made a sound that was almost a sigh. He revoked my read access to the board files yesterday at 3 p.m., she said. So he knows you're involved, Ethan said. He's suspected since I sent the package, but he can't move against me directly without drawing attention to why he'd want my access revoked. Charlotte closed the laptop. He'll be watching to see if I surface. He doesn't know where I am. He will soon, Victoria said. He's not passive. If he's revoked your access, he's already looking for you. She turned to Ray. How fast can the federal contact move on this? Ray was quiet for a moment. Faster if the evidence is already organized and delivered, he said, which means we spend tonight finishing the package and I drive it to Reyes personally tomorrow morning. Sunday morning. Daniel Reyes has a family and a lawn to mow on Sundays, Ray said, but he also has an open inquiry that just got a lot more interesting. He'll take the meeting. He looked around the table. We need to be finished by tonight, properly finished, indexed, labeled, everything in order. If this goes federal, the documentation needs to be clean enough that a prosecutor can pick it up and understand it in 30 minutes. I can do that, Charlotte said immediately, in the tone of someone describing a core professional competency. Good. Ray looked at Ethan. How's the forensic report? I need 2 hours to add the communication log correlations and run a final check on the technical language. Ethan paused. And I need to call my mother and tell her Maya's staying another night. It was the first personal thing he'd said out loud since the night before, and it landed in the room with a small, humanizing weight. Charlotte looked at him with an expression that was hard to categorize, something between reassessment and a kind of quiet respect. How old? She asked. 7, Ethan said. Charlotte nodded. Call her. He did, stepping outside into the parking lot while the afternoon light slanted low and orange across the gravel. His mother picked up on the second ring. She was fine. Maya was fine. They'd been to the farmer's market that morning, and Maya had talked some vendor into giving her a free sample of 3 different kinds of honey, which was, his mother noted dryly, apparently a genetic inheritance. Are you okay? His mother asked. Yeah, Ethan said. It's just complicated. Is this the car that came in last night? He'd mentioned it in a text that morning, vaguely. Yeah. Be careful, she said. Not in a worried way. In the direct way she'd always had, the way that meant she trusted him to know what careful looked like in a given situation and didn't need to define it for him. I will be, he said, and meant it. He went back inside. The next 4 hours were the hardest kind of work, not physically demanding, but the kind that requires sustained focus and continuous judgment. Every document had to be assessed for its evidentiary value, its source authentication, its place in the narrative. Every gap had to be noted honestly, because a package that overstated its evidence was worse than one that was modest. Prosecutors hated overreach. Judges hated overreach. Overreach gave defense attorneys room to maneuver. Ray had a particular discipline around this that Ethan respected. When Charlotte flagged a communication log entry as potentially significant, Ray would ask 3 questions. What does this prove on its own? What does it prove in context? And what's the most innocent explanation for this that a defense attorney would offer? If the innocent explanation was more plausible than the criminal one, the item went into the supporting evidence file rather than the primary package. It was slow. It was careful. It was the right way to do it. Victoria worked steadily through the evening without taking breaks that Ethan noticed. She ate half of a sandwich that Charlotte had produced from the document bag. Apparently she'd had the presence of mind to pack food and kept working. At one point she stopped and just sat very still for about 30 seconds, staring at a spreadsheet entry, and Ethan had the sense that she was doing something internally that wasn't about the document in front of her, processing something she hadn't had time to process yet. Then she picked up her pen and kept going. By 10:30 that night, the package was ready. 47 pages of primary documentation indexed and tabbed, a 12-page forensic engineering report, 8 pages of Charlotte's annotated communication logs, a 6-page financial summary prepared by Victoria that traced the shell company transactions in plain language accessible to a non-specialist reader, and a cover memo written by Ray in the spare, direct language of someone who has written a lot of cover memos for serious people in serious situations. Ray squared the stack on the table and looked at it for a moment. "This is good work," he said. Not enthusiastically. He didn't do enthusiasm either, but with a weight that made it mean something. Charlotte looked exhausted. The precise quality of her movements had gotten smaller over the hours, and there were shadows under her eyes that told a story of someone who hadn't been sleeping well for 6 weeks. "What happens to me if this goes wrong?" she asked. It was not a fearful question, more an operational one, the kind asked by someone who needs to know the parameters they're working within. "You documented internal wrongdoing through administrative access you legitimately held," Ray said. "The access revocation doesn't retroactively make the earlier access improper. You're a whistleblower, Charlotte. That has a specific legal meaning and a specific set of protections." He looked at her steadily. "You've been careful. What you did was careful." Charlotte absorbed that. "All right," she said. Victoria looked at her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I want to say that. You've been sitting with this alone for 6 weeks, and I know that wasn't easy, and I should have—" "You didn't know who to trust either," Charlotte said. "I understand that." She paused. "Your father would have had this figured out in the first 2 weeks, and he would have done it loudly and badly, and it probably would have made things worse." A small, precise, complicated expression crossed her face. Not quite a smile. "You've done it better." Victoria looked at the table for a moment. "He trusted the wrong people." "Yes," Charlotte said gently. "But he built something worth trusting." The shop was quiet after that. Outside, the October night had gotten cold and clear. The bee in the sign had finally stopped flickering, not because anyone fixed it, but because the bulb had given out completely. The sign now read, "Rook's Auto and Repair" in steady orange light, which Ethan thought was arguably worse. He made a mental note to order the part Monday, if he remembered. If Monday was a day when things like sign bulbs were the relevant concern. Ray picked up the document package and put it in a manila envelope, which he sealed and wrote on in black marker. He put it in his jacket's inner pocket and put on his coat. "I'll call Reyes tonight," he said. "Tell him I'm coming at 9. "He'll be annoyed," Victoria said. "He'll get over it." Ray picked up his keys. "You need somewhere to stay tonight, not your house, not the office." Victoria glanced at Charlotte. "I have a guest room," Charlotte said immediately. Ray nodded. He looked at Ethan last. "You good?" "I'm good," Ethan said. Ray studied him for a second. Not suspicious, just attentive, in the way of someone checking a structural joint before he put weight on it. Apparently it held because he nodded. "Lock up carefully," Ray said. He walked out into the night. A moment later, his car started and pulled out of the lot, headlights sweeping across the bay windows as he turned north toward Denver. Charlotte began putting her laptop away. Victoria stood by the workbench, her coat back on, looking at the car still on the lift. The Bentley that someone had tried to turn into a murder weapon, sitting there now, just a car again, waiting for the parts that Ethan had already ordered on his phone during a gap in the afternoon's work. "I'll need the car back eventually," she said. "Parts arrive Tuesday, probably Wednesday before it's done properly." "That's fine." She looked at him. "Thank you, Ethan." She said his name like it had weight, not performatively, just deliberately, like she was noting that she knew it and intended to remember it. "I mean that in a way that's bigger than the situation probably makes it seem." "It doesn't need to be bigger," he said. "You drove in. I looked at the car." She almost smiled at that. Not quite, but almost. Then she and Charlotte walked out, the side door falling shut behind them with a sound that echoed once in the empty bay. Ethan was alone in the shop. He stood in the middle of Bay 2 for a long moment, under the fluorescent lights, with the Bentley on the lift above him and the documents gone and the coffee machine cold. The shop smelled like it always smelled, oil and metal and rubber and time. His tools were where he'd left them.
The F-150 paperwork was still on the desk from Friday night, not yet filed. He turned off the bay lights and went to the back office and sat down in his chair and did not immediately do anything. He sat there, in the dark except for the steady orange glow coming through the window from the sign that now said Rooks, and he thought about 47 pages of evidence sitting in Ray Kowalski's jacket pocket on its way to a federal investigator's desk on a Sunday morning. He thought about a woman who had driven a sabotaged car into his parking lot by luck or instinct or whatever you called it, when the right terrible thing happens at the right moment. He thought about Maya, sleeping at his mother's house, dreaming about whatever 7-year-olds dreamed about. He sat there for a while. Then he got up, locked the shop, drove home, and slept harder than he had in months. He slept until 7, which was later than he'd slept on a weekend in probably 2 years. No alarm. Just his body deciding it had taken enough and shutting down with the blunt authority of something that doesn't negotiate. He lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the house. It was the particular quiet of a place where a child usually lived, but didn't currently. Not empty, exactly, but missing a frequency. Maya had a way of filling a house that had nothing to do with volume. It was more like a field, a kind of low-level hum of presence that you only noticed when it was gone. He got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard where Maya's bicycle was still leaning against the fence with a flat rear tire he'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. He drank his coffee and thought about the document package in Ray's jacket and Victoria Sinclair in Charlotte's guest room, and Marcus Hale, wherever Marcus Hale was on a Sunday morning, probably not aware yet that the trap he'd built so carefully over 14 months had started coming apart at the seams in a small repair shop 40 miles from his office. His phone buzzed at 7:43. Ray. "I'm outside Reyes's house," Ray said. No greeting. "He's already called me twice this morning. He read the summary memo I sent him last night." Ethan set down his coffee cup. "He moved fast." "He had an open inquiry with a missing piece," Ray said. "We handed him the piece. He knows what it is." A pause, and Ethan could hear a car door open. "He's coming out now. I'll call you after." Ray hung up. Ethan stood in his kitchen for a moment. Then he called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice had the quality of someone who had also slept, but not well. The particular slightly roughened edge that comes from lying in an unfamiliar room with too many things unresolved. "Ray's with Reyes," Ethan said. "I know. Ray texted Charlotte at 7. A beat. "Charlotte is making eggs. She made me sit at the kitchen table, which I think is her version of therapy. Is it working?" "The eggs are good," Victoria said, which was not really an answer but was honest in its way. "I keep running the board meeting in my head, trying to figure out what Marcus has prepared." "Don't," Ethan said. A pause. "Don't?" "You've built the case," he said. "Ray's got it in hand. What Marcus has prepared is what Marcus has prepared. You can't know it until you're in the room, and running it in your head all day isn't going to change it. It's just going to exhaust you before you get there." There was a silence on the line, not an offended one, more the silence of someone receiving a piece of advice that's annoying because it's correct. "That's surprisingly sensible for someone who fixes cars for a living," she said. "I've had a lot of time to practice sensible," Ethan said. "Single parenting does that." Another small silence, different in texture. "How old did you say Maya was?" 7. "She knows you're doing something important this weekend?" "She knows I'm working on a difficult car," Ethan said, which is technically accurate. Victoria made a sound that was almost a laugh. It came out slightly surprised, like she hadn't expected to laugh, and wasn't entirely sure it was appropriate. "I'll try not to run the board meeting in my head," she said. "No promises." "Fair enough," Ethan said. They hung up. He poured a second cup of coffee and called his mother, who told him Maya had eaten 3 pancakes and was currently trying to teach the neighbor's dog a trick that the dog seemed philosophically opposed to learning. He said he'd pick her up that evening. His mother said fine, and added in the careful, indirect way she had that he sounded like he'd been doing something that mattered. "Maybe," he said. "Good," she said simply, and left it there. He drove to the shop at 9. The Bentley was still on the lift where he'd left it, which he'd expected, but it still had a mild unreality to it,
like a scene from a different life that had accidentally persisted into the ordinary Sunday morning. He stood under the car for a few minutes, not to look at anything specifically, just to look. The brake line compromise was right there, patient and deliberate, exactly as it had been Friday night. Physical evidence didn't have the decency to feel less significant in daylight. If anything, it felt more specific in the flat October morning light coming through the bay windows, more intentional. He ordered the brake components he needed through the supplier portal, a job he'd already started on his phone Saturday afternoon but hadn't completed. He scheduled the delivery for Tuesday. Then he sat at the front desk and waited for Ray to call. Ray called at 10:22. Reyes wants to meet with Victoria today, Ray said. This afternoon, his office. He's going in on a Sunday, which tells you what he thinks of the package. What does he think of it? He used the word substantive, Ray said. For Daniel Reyes, that's the equivalent of a standing ovation. And the board meeting? He can't formally intervene in a private board session without a legal instrument he doesn't yet have, but he can make his presence known in ways that don't require one. A pause. He wants Victoria in his office at 2. Can you get her there? Why me? Because I need to spend the next 4 hours preparing a supplemental summary of the forensic report for his legal team, and Charlotte needs to write a formal witness statement, and someone needs to drive Victoria to Denver in a vehicle that isn't a company Bentley with compromised brakes. Ray said this patiently, like he'd already worked out the logistics, and Ethan was the last variable. Can you do that? Yeah, Ethan said. I can do that. He picked up Victoria at Charlotte's apartment at noon. She was waiting outside when he pulled up, which he'd somehow expected. She didn't strike him as someone who made other people wait on her behalf. She was wearing different clothes than the day before, borrowed from Charlotte, he assumed, which fit her well enough but had the slightly off quality of clothes chosen by someone who knows your size but not your preferences. Dark slacks, a gray sweater. She'd pulled her hair back more carefully than the night she'd walked into his lot. She looked like someone who'd decided to be presentable as an act of will. She got into the truck without commenting on it, which he appreciated. It was a 2014 F150 with 140,000 miles on it and a crack in the dashboard that he'd been filling with optimism for 2 years. Some people would have said something. She didn't. Ray says Reyes is bringing his legal team, she said, as they pulled onto the highway. That's good, right? It means he's taking it seriously. It also means there'll be people in the room who want to poke holes in the documentation. She looked out the window at the brown October landscape moving past. Which is their job. I'm not criticizing it. I just need to be ready to answer questions I haven't anticipated. What kind of questions? Questions about why I didn't go to law enforcement immediately when Charlotte sent me the package. She paused. The honest answer is that I wasn't sure who in my own organization was compromised and who wasn't. The less comfortable honest answer is that I was also scared of what it would do to the company's stock valuation if a fraud investigation became public before I had control of the narrative. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You're going to tell them both answers? If they ask, yes. She turned to look at him briefly. I found that trying to manage what investigators hear from you is usually worse than the thing you were trying to manage. They tend to find out anyway, and then you've got a credibility problem on top of whatever the original problem was. Did someone teach you that, or did you learn it the hard way? My father learned it the hard way with a state regulatory inquiry, about 7 years ago, she said. I watched. I paid attention. A beat. He was fine in the end, but it cost him more than it would have if he'd been straight with them from the beginning. They drove for a while without talking, which was a comfortable kind of silence. Not awkward, just two people who didn't need to fill space. The highway ran north through country that was flat and dry and enormous under a sky that Colorado did better than almost anywhere. That particular deep autumn blue that looked like it went on forever. Can I ask you something? Victoria said. Sure. The forensic consulting work you did before the shop, why did you stop? He'd expected a different question. He thought about the honest answer, which was the only answer he actually knew how to give. My daughter's mother left when Maya was 18 months old. Not dramatically. She just decided she'd made a mistake and she left, which she had the right to do. He said it without bitterness, which had taken him a couple of years to achieve. The consulting work meant travel. It meant depositions in 3 states and site visits that kept me away for days at a time. I needed something I could be present for. He paused. The shop was my uncle's. He was retiring. It was there. Do you miss it, the consulting? He considered that. I miss parts of it, the problem-solving part. Being the person in the room who looks at the physical evidence and tells the truth about what it means. He glanced at her sideways. This weekend reminded me I miss it more than I usually let myself think about. Victoria was quiet for a moment. You're good at it, she said. Not just technically. You're good at the human part of it, knowing when to push and when to let something be. That's just raising a 7-year-old, he said. She made that almost laugh sound again. This time it was a little less surprised. The federal building in Denver was mostly empty on a Sunday, which gave it the particular echo and linoleum quality of a large institutional space without its usual population. A security officer signed them in. A young woman in a blazer who introduced herself as Reyes's paralegal met them at the elevator and walked them up to the 4th floor without saying much beyond the basics of navigation. Daniel Reyes was not what Ethan had built in his head from Ray's description. He'd imagined something more imposing, the particular broad-shouldered authority of a federal investigator in the movies. What he got was a 50-year-old man in a cable-knit sweater and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, sitting behind a desk covered with printed documents, and 2 coffee cups in varying stages of emptiness, with the look of someone who'd been in this office since 8 in the morning and had made peace with his Sunday. He stood when they came in, shook both their hands, and pointed at the chairs across from his desk. Ms. Sinclair, he said, I've been looking at your company's financial structure for 4 months. I want to say up front that the documentation you've provided this morning significantly advances an inquiry that was otherwise going to take another 6 to 8 weeks to develop. He sat down. That doesn't mean I'm going to go easy on the questions. It means you deserve to know your cooperation is noticed. Understood, Victoria said. There were 2 other people in the room, a woman introduced as Reyes's lead attorney on the inquiry, and a younger man with a laptop who was apparently responsible for cross-referencing documents in real time. The attorney, whose name was Sarah Okafor, had the specific manner of someone who had spent a career listening carefully to what people said and more carefully to what they didn't say. She looked at Victoria the way a good poker player looks at a new opponent, not hostile but attentive in a way that didn't show its hand. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Ethan sat to the side and slightly back, not quite part of the table, which suited him. He was there as the forensic documentation author, not as a party to the investigation, and Reyes had been clear that his report would be treated as expert evidence rather than personal testimony, which meant they'd read it, they'd review it, they'd ask him technical clarification questions, but the main interrogation was Victoria's. She held up. Not perfectly. There were moments where she paused too long before answering, and 2 points where Okafor pushed on the gap between when Victoria received Charlotte's package and when she engaged outside help, and Victoria's answers in those moments were careful in a way that showed the seams. But she was honest, including about the parts that didn't reflect well on her, and she was precise, and she never once tried to oversell what the evidence proved versus what it suggested. Reyes noticed that. He made a small note when she drew the distinction herself, before he had to draw it for her. On the forensic report, Reyes asked Ethan 4 questions. They were good questions, specific and technical, aimed at the margins of the report where the engineering language was most dependent on professional judgment rather than observable fact. Ethan answered them straight, acknowledged one area where the evidence was inferential rather than definitive, and explained why the inferential conclusion was still the most technically defensible interpretation of what he'd seen. Reyes wrote something down. Near the end of the meeting, Reyes took off his reading glasses and held them loosely in one hand in a way that meant he was about to say something that mattered. "Here's where we are," he said. "What you've brought me this morning, combined with what our inquiry had already developed, gives us enough to seek a formal legal instrument before tomorrow morning. A judge we work with regularly has agreed to review an emergency application." He looked at Victoria. "That instrument will not stop your board meeting. What it will do is ensure that when certain individuals attempt to execute certain financial movements in conjunction with a potential leadership change at your company, Those movements will be immediately flagged and frozen. Victoria looked at him steadily. You're going to let the board meeting happen. We're going to let the people who believe they have the advantage walk into a room thinking they have the advantage, Reyes said. Yes. And if the board votes against me before anyone is arrested? Corporate governance decisions made under conditions of active fraud can be legally challenged and reversed, Okafor said from the side. A vote taken in the context of forged documentation presented as authentic evidence would not be a clean vote. That's a long process, Victoria said. It is, Okafor agreed. She didn't soften it. But it's less of a problem than you might think, because the financial freeze will prevent the transition of actual corporate control even if the nominal vote occurs. Marcus Hale cannot take operational control of company finances with his accounts frozen and a federal fraud investigation formally open against him. Victoria sat with that for a moment. Ethan watched her process it, the particular calculation of someone who had been hoping for cleaner, faster, more definitive, and was now adjusting to the version of events that was actually available. All right, she said. You'll need an attorney present at the board meeting, Reyes said. Your personal counsel. I'll call her tonight. And I want to be very clear, Reyes said, that nothing we've discussed here should be communicated to anyone connected to the company's current executive structure. Not to board members, not to staff, not to anyone who might, intentionally or otherwise, alert Marcus Hale to the status of this inquiry. Understood, Victoria said. One question. Reyes waited. Charlotte Keyes, Victoria said. She accessed internal documents through administrative credentials during a period when she believed fraud was occurring. I want to make sure that she... Whistleblower protections are robust in federal fraud inquiries, Reyes said. And the documentation methodology she used, using legitimately held access credentials before they were revoked, is well within the protections available to her. She should retain independent counsel, which I'd recommend regardless, but her legal exposure in this matter is minimal. He paused. She was careful. She was, Victoria said. She's been careful for 6 weeks, while nobody knew what she was sitting on. Reyes nodded. People like that make our jobs possible, he said simply, and picked his glasses back up, which meant the meeting was concluding. They drove back in the early afternoon light. The sky had gone a little higher and colder since morning, the kind of Sunday afternoon that felt like the season making a decision. Victoria didn't say anything for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Ethan let her have the silence. He'd learned over 2 years of parenting a child who processed things inwardly before she was ready to talk about them, that some silences needed to complete themselves before you could do anything useful with them. He's going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow believing he's already won, she said eventually. Yeah. He'll have his presentation, his forged misconduct evidence. He'll have the votes he thinks he's secured. She was looking straight ahead at the highway. He's going to look at me when I walk in and think he has me. And then you're going to take the room apart, Ethan said. And then I'm going to take the room apart, she agreed. She said it quietly, without drama, which somehow made it sound more certain than if she'd said it with conviction. They were 20 minutes from the shop when her phone rang. She looked at the screen and her expression tightened by 1 degree. It's one of the board members, she said. Philip Garrett. She hesitated. He's been with the board for 6 years. He was my father's appointment. I don't know where he stands on Marcus's plan. Answer it, Ethan said. She did. She put it on speaker without asking his permission, which felt like trust, and said, Philip. Victoria. The voice on the other end was older, with the careful pronunciation of someone from a generation that took diction seriously. I need to talk to you before tomorrow. I'm listening. A pause. Marcus came to see me on Friday evening. He presented documentation regarding certain financial decisions he claims you made in the past 8 months without proper board authorization. The man's voice was careful in the way of someone who had not yet decided what he believed, but was aware that what he said next had consequences. I want you to know that I found the presentation incomplete in ways that concerned me. Victoria glanced at Ethan. He kept his eyes on the road. What kind of incomplete, Philip? She said. The documentation he showed me had your signature on several authorization forms. I've seen your signature many times, Victoria. I knew your father for 30 years, and I watched you sign documents at board meetings for 4 years before you became CEO. The pause stretched. I don't believe those signatures are authentic. The truck was quiet, except for the road sound. I appreciate you telling me that, Victoria said, and her voice had a control in it that cost something. I've been sitting with this since Friday night, Garrett said. I didn't know who to call. Marcus has relationships with most of the board. I don't know who's aware of the full picture and who's simply been managed. A beat. Are you all right? Personally, I mean. I'm all right, she said. Your father would have... Garrett stopped himself. I'm sorry. That's not useful. No, Victoria said softly. But I know what you were going to say, and I appreciate it. Tomorrow, Garrett said. Whatever you have, bring it. I will, she said. He hung up. Victoria lowered the phone slowly. She looked at it for a moment, not at the screen, just at the object in her hand with an expression that was complicated in ways Ethan didn't try to read. He didn't go to Marcus after seeing the forged documents, she said. He sat on it for 2 days and called me instead. Some people do the right thing, Ethan said. Not enough of them, she said. Then, a beat later. More than I expected this weekend. He pulled into the shop lot at 3:15. She stayed in the truck for a moment after he cut the engine, looking at the shop front with the dead B and the sign that now read Rooks in flat orange afternoon light. Your sign is broken, she said. The bulb went out last night. I need to order the part. What does Rooks mean? Nothing, he said. It's just what's left when things stop working right. She almost smiled at that. A real one this time, brief and crooked and slightly tired at the edges. I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Okay. Are you scared? For yourself, I mean. If this goes wrong, Marcus has resources. He's demonstrated he's willing to go to extreme lengths to protect what he's built. She looked at him. You've been in the middle of this since Friday night. Your name is on the forensic report. He'll know that. Ethan thought about it honestly. Yes, he said. A little, but less than I'd be if I'd looked the other way Friday night and didn't fix the car. She looked at him for a moment. That's a strange thing to say. The brake line was already cut when you drove in, he said. I didn't create the danger. I just found it. The danger was already there. He looked at the shop. I'd rather know about it than not. She was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the truck door and stepped out into the cold afternoon air. She turned back once. I'll see you tomorrow, she said. After. Yeah, he said. Let me know how it goes. She nodded and walked to Charlotte's car, which was parked along the side of the building. Ethan watched her go, then sat in the truck for a moment by himself. Through the shop windows, he could see the Bentley still on the lift, still waiting, the damage still there, and now formally documented in a 47-page package sitting in a federal investigator's office. He picked up his phone and called his mother. I'll be there at 5, he said. Tell Maya I'm bringing pizza. She'll negotiate for extra cheese, his mother said. She always does, he said. He went inside and finished the F-150 paperwork he'd left on the desk Friday night. It took 20 minutes. He filed it, locked up the shop, and drove to his mother's house. Maya was in the front yard when he pulled in, doing something complicated with a jump rope that seemed to involve rules only she understood. She looked up when she heard the truck and dropped the rope without hesitation, running across the yard in that full-body way of children who haven't yet learned to moderate their physical expressions of feeling. She hit him at full speed, and he caught her, and she smelled like outside and maple syrup. And she said, Dad, did you fix the hard car? Working on it, he said. Is it a really hard car? It's the hardest one I've ever had, he said. She pulled back and looked at him with the particular evaluating expression she got sometimes. Too old for her age, like she was checking something she couldn't quite name. Then apparently she decided whatever she was checking was fine. Can we get extra cheese, she said. Already planned on it, he said. He carried her inside. Whatever was coming Monday morning, whatever Reyes's legal instrument produced, whatever Marcus Hale walked into that boardroom believing, whatever vote was cast or wasn't cast, Whatever version of justice worked its way through the machinery of federal investigation and corporate law and human fallibility. None of it was here yet. Here was his mother's kitchen and his daughter's voice and a pizza order and the particular irreplaceable weight of a 7-year-old who trusted you completely because you'd earned it. He held on to that. Tomorrow was going to be what it was going to be. Tonight, he was just her father. That was enough. That had always been enough. And maybe the thing he'd been missing, the thing this strange weekend had cracked open in him, was the understanding that being enough in one place didn't mean you couldn't be more in another. He'd think about that later. Right now, Maya was showing him the trick she'd tried to teach the neighbor's dog, which involved sitting and raising one paw simultaneously while maintaining eye contact. And she was doing all three at once with complete commitment and zero self-consciousness. And he laughed out loud. The real kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere without asking permission. And the sound of it filled the kitchen, and his mother smiled from the stove and everything else, for this one ordinary evening held still. Ethan dropped Maya at school Monday morning at 7:50, which was 4 minutes later than usual because she'd changed her shoes twice and then couldn't find her library book, which turned out to be under the couch in a location that defied any reasonable theory of how it got there. He watched her run through the school's front entrance without looking back. She never looked back, which he'd decided early on was a good sign rather than a sad one. And then he sat in the parking lot for a moment with the engine running. His phone showed 2 texts, one from Ray, sent at 6:44 a.m. Reyes got the instrument. Meeting him at 8:30. Board session starts at 10. The second from Victoria, sent at 7:12. Walking in at 10. My attorney will be there. Whatever happens. Thank you for Sunday. No punctuation on the last sentence. He wasn't sure if that was intentional or not. He typed back, "You've got this," then deleted it because it sounded like something on a motivational poster. He typed, "Call me after." Sent that instead. He drove to the shop. There was no useful reason for him to be at the shop specifically. The Bentley parts wouldn't arrive until Tuesday. His Monday appointments were 2 oil changes and a brake inspection on a Subaru, none of which required him to be there before 9. But he went anyway, because the alternative was sitting at home running the board meeting in his head, which was the thing he'd told Victoria not to do and which he now found he was completely incapable of avoiding himself. He got there at 8:15, made coffee, and sat at the front desk. He looked at the Bentley on the lift. He looked at the space on the workbench where the documents had been spread out Saturday morning, now empty, the drop cloth folded back the way he'd left it Sunday. The shop smelled the same as it always smelled. The compressor ticked. Outside, the October sky was doing what it did. Flat gray this morning, low cloud cover, the kind of light that made everything look slightly unresolved. At 8:47, his first appointment arrived. A 2021 Subaru Forester with a woman named Patricia who came in every 6 months with the same car in the same good condition and always brought him a coffee from the drive-thru 2 blocks away because, she'd explained once, she appreciated someone who took care of things properly. She handed him the coffee. He accepted it. She sat in the waiting area with a book. He went to work on her Forester and let the physical routine of it, the familiar weight of tools, the specific logic of component inspection, the small satisfaction of a system functioning the way it was supposed to. Quiet the part of his brain that was 25 miles north in a conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Denver office building. He finished Patricia's Forester at 9:40 and was explaining his findings. Brakes were fine, nothing to worry about for at least another 8 months, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it until Patricia left, then looked. Ray. Federal team is in the building. Reyes has 2 agents positioned outside the boardroom. We're watching. Ethan read the text twice. Positioned outside the boardroom, not inside. Outside. Which meant Victoria was in there alone except for her attorney, walking into whatever Marcus Hale had prepared, and the federal presence was a perimeter rather than a shield. He put the phone in his pocket and went to work on the first oil change. The boardroom on the 14th floor of Sinclair Automotive Group's Denver headquarters was a room designed to communicate power, which was something Gerald Sinclair had understood and had spent money on accordingly. Floor-to-ceiling windows on the north wall, a table of pale birch and brushed steel that seated 16. chairs that cost more per unit than most people's monthly car payments, a presentation system built into the wall that could display anything from financial projections to satellite imagery with equal seamlessness. Gerald had believed that the room you negotiated in told people what kind of company they were negotiating with. Victoria had always found the room slightly too large for its actual purpose, like a suit cut for someone else. She arrived at 9:52 with her attorney, Catherine Lim, 47, compact and precise, with 20 years of corporate law experience and the particular stillness of someone who was never the most visibly aggressive person in a room and never needed to be. Catherine had been Victoria's personal counsel for 3 years. Victoria had called her Sunday evening and explained the situation in broad strokes, and Catherine had listened without interrupting and then said, "Send me the documentation package. I'll review it tonight and meet you tomorrow morning." Which she had, arriving at the building lobby at 9:35 with the package annotated in red pen and a set of questions written on a legal pad that she wanted answered before they went upstairs. They'd answered them in the lobby coffee area in 15 minutes. Catherine had capped her pen, put the legal pad in her bag, and said, "The forensic report is strong. The financial documentation is sufficient. The communication logs are your most vulnerable point, because the chain of custody runs through Charlotte's personal actions, but they're corroborated enough by the other materials that I wouldn't worry." She'd looked at Victoria directly. "Don't speak unless you have to in the first half of the meeting. Let him make his case. You want the board to see the full shape of what he's presenting before you respond. Don't interrupt. Don't react visibly." A pause. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Victoria had said. "Good." Catherine had stood up and picked up her bag. "Let's go." The boardroom had 7 people in it when they arrived. 5 board members, Marcus Hale, and a man Victoria didn't recognize who was sitting slightly apart from the table with a laptop, which she registered immediately as wrong. Outside counsel, probably, or some kind of documentation specialist Marcus had brought in for the presentation. The board members were Philip Garrett, who caught Victoria's eye when she entered and gave her a look of careful, restrained acknowledgement. Sandra Tsi, who was a financial analyst and had been on the board for 4 years and whose expression gave nothing away. Robert Callahan, who was the board's longest-serving member and who had the quality of a man who had survived enough corporate upheaval to be fundamentally unshockable. And 2 newer members, Diana Walsh and Preston Mercer, both of whom Marcus had recommended for their appointments 8 months ago, which Victoria had noted at the time and noted again now. Marcus Hale was standing near the presentation system when she walked in. He was 54, lean in the way of men who worked at it deliberately, with silver at his temples and the kind of polished professional manner that takes years to build and is, once built, almost indistinguishable from genuine authority. He'd been with the company since her father hired him 11 years ago. He'd sat at this table for 11 years of board meetings. He'd stood at her father's funeral and talked about loyalty and legacy and the kind of man Gerald Sinclair had been. He looked at her now with the controlled, measured expression of someone managing a situation he believed he controlled. "Victoria," he said, "I wasn't sure you'd come." "Why wouldn't I?" she said. He didn't answer that. He gestured to the table. "We should get started." Victoria sat down. Catherine sat beside her. Across the table, Sandra Tsi was watching both of them with the attentive neutrality of someone who was reserving judgment and knew she was doing it. Robert Callahan was looking at his hands. The 2 Marcus appointees, Walsh and Mercer, were looking at Marcus. Philip Garrett was looking at his coffee cup. Marcus began. The presentation was professional. Ethan had been right Friday night when he told Victoria not to try to anticipate it. It was more sophisticated than she would have predicted, and in some places more subtle. Marcus didn't open with accusations. He opened with concern. He framed the first 15 minutes around what he described as anomalies in the company's operational authorization structure over the past 8 months. Patterns of decision-making that, he said, bypassed standard board oversight protocols in ways that created significant corporate liability exposure. He spoke well. He had slides. The slides had numbers on them, and the numbers were presented with the kind of clean, authoritative formatting that implies accuracy through visual confidence. He cited 3 specific instances of what he described as unauthorized financial commitments, each accompanied by a document bearing Victoria's signature and a date. Victoria sat still and let him talk. She kept her hands flat on the table in front of her, which was something she'd learned to do in tense meetings, because it prevented her from doing things with her hands that could be read as tells. Catherine was writing notes on her legal pad at a pace that meant she was flagging specific claims. The scratch of the pen was the only sound on their side of the table. At the 20-minute mark, Marcus shifted tone. The concern became more direct. He told the board that he had, reluctantly and after significant consideration, concluded that Victoria's leadership had introduced risk to the company that the board had a fiduciary obligation to address. He said it carefully. He said it with the face of a man performing reluctance he did not feel. Then he presented the misconduct documentation. 3 pages, printed on company letterhead, each one bearing a copy of what was represented as Victoria's signature alongside an authorization code that would, to someone without access to the company's internal document management system, appear completely authentic. He placed them on the table and slid copies to each board member. Victoria looked at the document in front of her. She looked at the signature on it. It was a good forgery, better than she'd expected. Someone had studied her signature carefully. But there was a quality to the pressure distribution of the strokes, a particular way the letters connected that was off by a fraction. She'd noticed the same thing in the copies Charlotte had photographed weeks ago, like a musician who can play all the right notes in the wrong order. She looked up. Marcus was watching her. She held his gaze for a moment and said nothing. Marcus took her silence as the response he'd expected, the silence of someone caught, and moved to close. He told the board that he was formally requesting an emergency leadership review vote. He cited the company's bylaws, the specific provision that allowed for an emergency session vote on executive leadership under conditions of documented misconduct. He cited it accurately, which meant he'd had his outside counsel verify it, which meant this had been prepared with legal care. Diana Walsh said, "Given the documentation provided, I think a leadership review vote is appropriate." Preston Mercer nodded. Sandra Tse said nothing. Robert Callahan looked at the document in front of him and then looked at Victoria with an expression she couldn't read. Philip Garrett set his copy down on the table very deliberately. "Before we proceed to any vote," Garrett said, "I think we should hear from Victoria." Marcus looked at Garrett. Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. "This isn't a defense hearing, Philip. It's a board meeting," Garrett said, with the particular calm of someone who has been in enough rooms long enough to know when to be immovable. "And Victoria is the company's CEO. She sits at this table. She speaks at this table." He looked at Victoria. "Victoria." Catherine put her pen down. Victoria opened the folder she'd brought in. She didn't stand up. Standing would have been performative, and performance was Marcus's tool, not hers. She stayed seated and placed the first item on the table, a printed copy of Ethan's forensic engineering report, 12 pages, tabbed at key sections with small adhesive flags. "Before I address what Marcus has presented," she said, "I want to draw the board's attention to what happened to my vehicle last Friday night." Her voice was level. Not cold, level. The distinction mattered. Cold was distance. Level was control. "My Bentley was inspected by a forensic engineer on Friday night. This report documents the findings. The rear brake circuit had been deliberately compromised in a manner consistent with engineering-level knowledge of hydraulic failure mechanics. The failure was designed to manifest at highway speed." She looked around the table. "If I had continued driving that vehicle past Friday night, the failure would likely have been fatal." The room was very quiet. Marcus's expression had not changed. He was too controlled for that. But the man with the laptop near the wall had stopped typing. "This report," Victoria continued, "was prepared by Ethan Brooks, a forensic engineer with 6 years of documented case experience prior to his current work, whose credentials and methodology are detailed on pages 2 and 3. She slid a copy toward each board member. "I would ask the board to read the executive summary on page 1 before we proceed." Sandra C. picked it up and read. She read it twice. Robert Callahan read it once and set it down and looked at Marcus with an expression that was no longer neutral. Marcus said, "Victoria, I understand you've had a frightening experience, but I don't see what a vehicle maintenance issue has to do with..." "The second item," Victoria said, without raising her voice and without acknowledging his interruption as an interruption worth acknowledging. She placed the financial documentation summary on the table. 6 pages, plain language, structured the way Ray had insisted, accessible to non-specialists with specific transaction dates, amounts, entity names, and source citations for every claim. This is a summary of financial activity conducted through 6 shell entities incorporated in Nevada and Delaware over a 14-month period, she said. The entities have no operational history, no legitimate business function, and no relationship to Sinclair Automotive Group's authorized subsidiary structure. The funds moved through these entities originate from company operational accounts and were authorized using a workflow that, in multiple instances, appears to bear forged or improperly obtained authorization signatures. She paused, including my father's signature, during a period when his medical condition would have made careful review of authorization paperwork impossible. Preston Mercer had stopped looking at Marcus. He was looking at the financial summary now, and his expression had changed in the particular way of someone who had been standing on ground he believed was solid and has just felt it shift. Diana Walsh's hands were still on the table. She hadn't picked up the financial summary yet. She was watching Marcus. "These documents," Marcus said, and his voice was steady, but it had lost its earlier quality. The certainty had become something harder and more effortful. "Are not authenticated. They're the third item," Victoria said. She placed Charlotte's annotated communication logs on the table. 8 pages. At the top of the first page, in Charlotte's precise handwriting, was a note identifying the source, the access methodology, and the date range of the documentation. "These are internal communications accessed through the company's executive communications platform," Victoria said. "I want to draw specific attention to the exchange on page 4 dated 7 weeks ago between an internal executive account and an external relay address." She waited a moment for the board members to find the page. The exchange discusses what is described as a vehicle assessment protocol with a confirmed delivery timeline. The timing of this exchange precedes the modification of my vehicle's brake system by 3 weeks. Sandra C. looked up from the page. Her eyes went to Marcus. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Robert Callahan said quietly, "Marcus." Marcus said nothing. "The signatures on the documents you've presented to this board," Victoria said, turning to the misconduct paperwork Marcus had distributed, "are forgeries. I can demonstrate this through a comparison analysis if the board requires it, but I would suggest that the board consider these materials in their totality before drawing any conclusion about whose conduct requires review." She looked at each board member in turn, ending with Marcus. "I am not the person at this table who has committed misconduct." The silence after she finished was the kind of silence that has weight. Not the silence of a room where nothing is happening, but the silence of a room where too much has just happened and everyone is recalibrating simultaneously. Marcus opened his mouth. The boardroom door opened. Daniel Reyes didn't knock. He stepped in with the quiet authority of someone who has a legal instrument in his jacket pocket and doesn't need to announce it because his presence announces it. The woman behind him was Sarah Okafor, and behind her were 2 other individuals who had the particular bearing of federal agents trying to look like they weren't federal agents, which they weren't managing especially well. Reyes looked around the room. He found Marcus Hale and held his gaze. "I apologize for the interruption," Reyes said, in a tone that did not apologize at all. "My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm with the Federal Corporate Fraud Division. I have a legal instrument here authorizing the immediate freeze of certain financial accounts connected to Sinclair Automotive Group and its associated entities, pending a formal fraud inquiry." He reached into his jacket. "I also need to speak with Marcus Hale at his earliest convenience, which is now." Marcus went still. Not the controlled stillness he'd maintained for the past 40 minutes. A different kind of stillness. The stillness of a man whose internal architecture has just collapsed and who is holding the outside together by instinct while the inside catches up. He looked at Victoria. She looked back at him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to say anything. The morning had already said it. Catherine Lim picked up her legal pad and wrote something on it and slid it across to Victoria. Victoria read it. "Don't speak. Let Reyes control the room from here." Victoria nodded slightly. Reyes was speaking to the board, explaining in the measured language of federal procedure what the legal instrument meant, what it authorized, and what the board's obligations were in the context of an active federal fraud inquiry. He said it clearly and without excess. Okafor had moved to a position near the presentation system and was looking at the slides Marcus had prepared with the expression of someone cataloging items for later retrieval. Robert Callahan said, "Are we under obligation to halt the meeting?" "You're not under obligation to halt it," Reyes said. "You are under obligation not to execute any financial transactions or governance decisions that would conflict with the terms of the freeze order." He placed the instrument on the table. Any vote resulting in a leadership transition at this company would trigger the freeze's secondary provisions and would itself become subject to legal review. Diana Walsh said very carefully, "I'd like to consult with outside counsel before we proceed with any vote." "That is absolutely your right," Reyes said. Preston Mercer had said nothing since Reyes entered the room. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man reviewing how he'd arrived at his current position and not liking the route. Marcus said, "I need to make a call." "You're welcome to do that," Reyes said. "Agent Donahue will accompany you." One of the two men who didn't look like federal agents stepped forward. Marcus looked at him, then at Reyes, then at Victoria one more time. The look lasted about 2 seconds. It wasn't anger, or it was anger, but underneath the anger was something else. Something more complicated and more diminished. The look of a man who had built something elaborate and patient over a long time and has just watched it not work. Then he turned and walked toward the door, and Agent Donahue fell into step beside him, and they left the room. The boardroom door closed. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Philip Garrett said, to no one in particular, "Well." He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "I think we should probably table the vote." Sandra C. made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "I think that's the most conservative possible description of where we are, Philip." "I've always been conservative," Garrett said mildly. Robert Callahan looked at Victoria. He was 71, and he'd been on this board through 2 recessions and 1 restructuring and Gerald Sinclair's death, and he had the particular gravity of someone who has seen enough to know what things cost. "Victoria," he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "For what?" "For not asking harder questions sooner." He said it flatly, without excess self-recrimination, which was actually the more honest version of accountability. "I should have seen more of this." "He was careful," Victoria said, "and you trusted him for 11 years. That's not nothing." "No," Callahan said, "but it should have been less." Reyes was speaking quietly with Okafor near the window. The board members were in various states of processing. Garrett methodical, C precise, Callahan waited, Walsh and Mercer trying to figure out how visible their prior alignment with Marcus should be treated. The answer, Victoria suspected, was that it depended on what Reyes's inquiry developed, and on whether they had been genuinely deceived or had known more than they'd acknowledged. She had suspicions about the latter, but no proof. That was for Reyes to determine. Catherine leaned toward her and said quietly, "How are you doing?" "I'm fine," Victoria said. Catherine looked at her with the specific expression she used when she believed something was true but incomplete. "That's the first time today you've said something I don't entirely believe." Victoria looked at the table in front of her, at the forensic report and the financial summary and Charlotte's communication logs, this documentation that had traveled from her car's hidden panel to a federal investigator's hands to this table in 4 days. She thought about her father's signature on documents he'd never properly reviewed. She thought about Marcus at the funeral, talking about loyalty. "I'm tired," she said. "And it's complicated." "That I believe," Catherine said. Reyes came over to the table and sat down across from Victoria. He had the unhurried manner of someone operating on his own timeline, which was, she'd noticed yesterday, genuinely how he moved. Not rushed, not slow, but self-determined in a way that meant external pressure didn't really register as pressure. "Marcus Hale is being interviewed in the conference room down the hall," Reyes said. "His counsel will arrive within the hour, at which point the interview becomes more formal." He looked at Victoria. "I want to be transparent with you about the next steps, because you've been cooperative and because you deserve to understand the process." "Thank you," she said. The financial freeze is in place. That's immediate and significant. It means he cannot move the funds that are currently sitting in the shell entities, which, by our estimate, represents a substantial amount. The formal charges will take time. We need to complete the inquiry, compile a prosecutorial package, work through the appropriate channels. He paused. This is not a fast process. I know, she said. What it means for your company's leadership position is that any governance action that would have followed from this board meeting is effectively suspended until the legal picture clarifies. You remain CEO. The board retains its current composition. The company continues operating. He held her gaze. That's the practical reality as of today. And Charlotte Keyes? Ms. Keyes is formally identified as a cooperating witness in the inquiry. Her protections are in place. A small pause. She'll need to provide a formal deposition in the coming weeks. She'll be treated with the respect her cooperation warrants. Victoria nodded. What about the person who modified my vehicle? Reyes's expression was careful. That's a separate criminal matter from the corporate fraud inquiry, and it's being handled by a different division. I'm not in a position to discuss its specifics, but I can tell you it's being taken seriously as a potential attempted homicide case. He paused. We have the photograph from the USB drive. We have the communication log references. We have the forensic documentation Mr. Brooks prepared. He looked at her steadily. We're looking. She sat with that for a moment. Attempted homicide. The words had a different weight when said by a federal investigator in an official context than they did in a small repair shop at 1 a.m. All right, she said. She straightened slightly. What do I need from you right now, procedurally, to ensure that today's board session doesn't create any unresolved governance issues? Reyes almost smiled. Okafor has prepared a one-page guidance document for your board on exactly that question, he said. She'll provide it to your attorney. Catherine was already looking at Okafor across the room. Okafor was already reaching into her bag. Good, Victoria said. She picked up the forensic report from the table in front of her, the copy she'd brought for the board, and looked at it for a moment. Ethan's name was in the header. His credentials, his methodology, his careful and honest accounting of what he'd found under her car on a Friday night. 12 pages that had started as a mechanic looking at a brake system because a woman handed him her keys and drove away. She put it back in her folder. The board meeting adjourned 40 minutes later without a vote and without resolution on anything except the implicit understanding that the landscape had changed and everyone in the room needed time to understand the new one. Callahan walked out with Reyes, asking questions in the careful way of a man who genuinely wanted to understand the process. Sandra C. left quickly, already on her phone. Walsh and Mercer left together and didn't make eye contact with Victoria on the way out. Garrett stopped at the door. Your father would have been proud, he said. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I wanted to say it. Victoria looked at him. He would have been frustrated that it took this long, she said. Garrett considered that. Probably, he agreed. He was always impatient with the distance between what was right and what was done about it. He paused. That's one thing I think you share. He left. Catherine gathered her papers. I need 2 hours to review the Okafor guidance document, and then I'll call you with a briefing on your governance position. She looked at Victoria. Go somewhere that isn't this building. I will. Eat something, Catherine said. You've been running on nothing since Friday. I know. I mean, actually eat something, not coffee. Victoria almost smiled. Yes, Catherine. She took the elevator down alone and walked out through the lobby into the cold October morning. The sky was still low and gray, the clouds not moving. Denver looked like itself, large and indifferent and continuing, the way cities do regardless of what happens in the rooms inside them. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the cold air. She took out her phone and called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring. She could hear shop sounds in the background, the specific ambient noise of mechanical work, metal and compressors, and the small radio he apparently kept on in the bay. How'd it go? He said. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building where Marcus Hale was currently being interviewed by a federal agent, where 7 board members had just seen 14 months of careful deception come apart in 45 minutes, where a table in a 14th floor conference room still held copies of a forensic report written by a mechanic who hadn't been expecting any of this on Friday night. "It went," she said, a pause on his end. "That's not a lot of information. Marcus is with federal investigators right now. The board didn't vote. The financial freeze is in place." She paused. "Your report held up." She heard him exhale. Not dramatically, just a quiet release of something that had been held. "Good," he said. "Reyes used the word substantive again," she said. "About your work specifically." Another short pause. "That's a good word?" "It is." She watched a cab go by on the street. "I'm going to find somewhere to eat, apparently. My attorney is concerned about my nutritional situation." "Sounds like a reasonable attorney." "She is." Victoria looked up at the building behind her, 14 floors of glass and steel, and then looked away from it. "Ethan, the consulting role, the one I mentioned, overseeing independent safety investigations across the company's fleet operations." She paused. "I meant it. I want you to think about it. No pressure, no timeline. But I meant it." Silence on his end, not an uncomfortable one. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she said. "Go fix someone's car. I'll call you in a few days." She hung up and put her phone in her pocket and walked down the sidewalk looking for somewhere to eat, because Catherine was right, and she hadn't eaten a real meal since Saturday morning, and the world was still turning, and the next thing was the next thing. Behind her, somewhere on the 14th floor, the morning was still unfinished. Federal investigators with legal instruments and evidence packages, and the slow machinery of accountability moving forward the way it moved. Not fast, not clean, but forward. The documentation that had traveled from a hidden panel in a black Bentley to a work table in a small repair shop to this building in 4 days was doing its work. And Ethan Brooks was back in Bay 2, probably underneath someone else's car, which was, she thought, exactly where he should be, where he'd been all along, just a man who looked at things carefully and told the truth about what he saw. The rest apparently followed from that. The Bentley parts arrived Tuesday afternoon, 20 minutes before Ethan had estimated, which was the kind of small logistical victory that felt disproportionately satisfying after the kind of weekend he'd had. He signed for the delivery, carried the components into Bay 2, and spent the next 3 hours doing the work he'd originally been handed the keys to do, replacing the compromised brake lines, flushing and rebuilding the hydraulic circuit, testing the system with the methodical care that the job required regardless of what else had happened around it. It was good work, straightforward in a way the last 4 days hadn't been. The problem was defined. The solution was defined, and the gap between them was just time and competence. He had both. He was finishing the final pressure test when his phone rang. "Ray." "Marcus Hale retained counsel yesterday afternoon," Ray said. "Federal interview concluded at 4 p.m. His attorney issued a statement saying he intends to cooperate fully with the inquiry, which in my experience means he intends to say as little as possible while appearing cooperative." A pause. "Reyes called me this morning. The financial freeze captured approximately $4.3 million across the 6 shell entities." Ethan set down the pressure gauge. $4 million. 4.3, Ray said. "Over 14 months, and that's what they caught. That's what was still sitting in the accounts when the freeze hit. There were earlier transfers that had already moved to secondary destinations. They're tracing those now." His voice had the dry, measured quality of a man reporting facts he found troubling but not surprising. He built it to accumulate, long-term. The escalating payment pattern Victoria identified, that was the architecture. Small enough not to trigger automatic flags. Regular enough to be systematic. He was going to do this for 20 years, Ethan said. If the takeover plan had worked, probably longer, Ray said. With Victoria out and himself in operational control, there wouldn't have been anyone positioned to notice. A beat. "Your report is in the formal evidentiary record. Reyes's team has retained it as expert documentation. You may be contacted for a formal deposition in the coming months." "That's fine," Ethan said. "I know it's fine," Ray said. "I just want you to be prepared for the timeline. These things move slowly. You've told me that before." "It keeps being true," Ray said. After he hung up, Ethan finished the pressure test, confirmed the brake circuit was clean and functioning correctly, and lowered the Bentley off the lift. He drove it forward out of the bay and parked it in the front lot. He stood beside it for a moment in the cold afternoon light. It was just a car now. An expensive, well-maintained car with new brake lines and a properly rebuilt hydraulic system, sitting in a gravel lot outside a small shop with a broken sign. It looked like nothing in particular had happened to it. It looked like exactly what it was, a machine that had been broken and was now fixed. He went inside and wrote up the service report. In the weeks that followed, life did what life does, which is continue in its ordinary way, regardless of what extraordinary things have recently happened inside it. Ethan picked Maya up from school every day at 3:15. He cooked dinners that were sometimes good and sometimes not. He fixed cars, a transmission on a Honda Accord that had been degenerating for 6 months, a persistent electrical fault in a Jeep that took him 3 days to trace to a corroded ground connection behind the dashboard, an engine mount replacement on a Ford that should have been straightforward and wasn't. He ordered the part for the sign's broken B and installed it himself on a Thursday afternoon, and the sign went back to reading Brooks Auto and Repair in steady orange light, which was correct even if it wasn't as interesting. Maya noticed the sign. "It says your name again," she said from the back seat of the truck one afternoon as they pulled out of the lot. "Yeah," he said. "It was broken for a long time." "It was," he said. "Did you fix it?" "I fixed it," he said. She appeared to consider this from whatever internal framework 7-year-olds use for considering things. "Good," she said, and went back to looking out the window. Victoria called on a Thursday, 2.5 weeks after the board meeting. He was at the back desk doing invoices, which was the part of running a small business he liked least and was worst at, when her name came up on his screen. He answered. "The board restructuring is complete," she said, without preamble, which was her way. Walsh and Mercer resigned. 2 new members were appointed through an independent nominating process with Reyes's team as observers, which is unusual, but the board agreed to it given the circumstances. A pause. "Robert Callahan is staying. Philip Garrett is staying. Sandra Tsiz is staying." "Good choices," Ethan said. "I thought so." A beat. Charlotte has been formally reinstated with expanded scope. Her title is now Chief Administrative Officer. She fought me on it for about 15 minutes and then accepted it. Ethan smiled at the invoice in front of him. "Sounds like Charlotte." She also informed me that she expects to leave at 5 o'clock on Fridays from now on, which she has never once done in 9 years. Victoria's voice had a quality in it he'd come to recognize. Not quite warmth, but something adjacent to it. Something that came out when she was talking about people she trusted. I told her that was entirely reasonable. "Is she going to actually do it?" "Probably not at first," Victoria said. "But eventually." She paused. "The company is operating. The accounts that weren't frozen are functioning normally. We've been transparent with our major clients about the investigation, proactively, before the news started moving, which Catherine insisted on and which was the right call. We lost 2 smaller contracts. We retained the 3 that mattered most." "How are you?" Ethan asked. A short silence. Not the kind that meant she didn't have an answer. The kind that meant she was deciding how honest to be. "Tired," she said. "Angry, still, in a way that comes and goes. There are days when I go through the whole day fine, and then I sit down at night and I just feel how much it cost." Another pause. "My father trusted that man. He brought him coffee on his first day. He gave him a key to the executive floor after 6 months because he believed in giving people real responsibility when they showed they could handle it." She was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about what my father would do with the anger. He would have been furious. He would have made it loud, and then he would have put it down and moved forward, because he was practical that way. He didn't carry things." "You carry things differently," Ethan said. "I carry them longer," she said. "I'm working on it." He didn't say it would get easier, because that was the kind of thing people said when they had nothing more useful to offer, and it was only sometimes true. He said, "That makes sense," because it did, and let her have it. "The consulting role," she said then, and her voice shifted slightly. Not harder, but more purposeful. "I want to make it real. Not a favor, not a thank you. A real position, with a real scope. Independent safety investigations across the company's fleet operations, third-party review of maintenance protocols and vehicle modification records for our commercial and executive fleets. It's a gap we have. I can see it clearly now, in a way I couldn't before. A pause. The position would be part-time initially, enough that you could maintain the shop. I'm not asking you to give anything up. Ethan leaned back in his chair. The shop was quiet around him. It was after hours. His last employee had gone home at 6. The bays were dark, except for the light in the office. Through the window, he could see the sign working correctly. Could see the front lot where the Bentley had sat for 4 days carrying everything it carried. "I've been thinking about it," he said. "I know, I didn't want to push." "I know you didn't." He looked at the ceiling, which needed repainting and had needed it for a year. "Maya asked me last week if I was going to keep fixing cars forever." "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know forever, but I was going to keep fixing cars for a long time." He paused. "She said that was fine because she liked that I smelled like the shop when I picked her up. Apparently it's distinctive." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "She sounds like a good kid." "She's a great kid," he said. "She's difficult and funny, and she negotiates for extra cheese on pizza with the focus of a trial attorney, and she's the best thing I've ever done." He said it simply, without decoration, the way you say something that's just true. "I want to be able to tell her someday that I didn't just stay inside what was easy because it was easier." He paused. "So yeah, I'll take the role." "Good," Victoria said, and then, after a beat, "The smell is motor oil and steel, in case you were wondering. It's not a bad smell." "I know what it is," he said. "I know you do," she said. "I'll have Catherine send the contract details this week." They worked out the basics before hanging up. Scope, schedule, the particular logistics of someone maintaining one professional life while beginning another. It was a practical conversation. That was fine. The other conversations, the ones that had mattered more, had already happened in a different register, over a workbench at 2 a.m, and in a truck on a highway, and in the brief, complicated silences between people who'd been through something real together. When he hung up, he sat for a while in the quiet office. He thought about his uncle, who had handed him this shop like handing someone a life raft, and who hadn't known he was doing anything except retiring. He thought about the 2 years of consulting work, the depositions and site visits, and the particular satisfaction of being in a room and being the honest one. He thought about the version of himself that had folded all of that up and put it in a drawer because the immediate thing, Maya, the shop, the dailiness of showing up, was what was needed, and showing up was what you did. He hadn't been wrong to put it in the drawer. The drawer had been the right place for it for those years, while Maya was small and the world was figuring itself out. But the drawer wasn't a coffin. You could open it again. Things you'd put away carefully had a way of waiting. The next morning he told Maya over breakfast. He'd thought about how to explain it. She was 7, the corporate fraud angle was not going to be the useful part of the story, and had decided on a version that was simple and true. He told her that a woman had brought her car in on Friday night with something wrong that turned out to be serious, and that he'd helped figure it out, and that because of that she was offering him some work doing what he used to do before he had the shop. Maya listened with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered, which was different from the scattered attention she gave to things like homework and putting her shoes on the right feet. "What did you used to do?" she asked. "Something like being a detective," he said. "But for cars and machines. When something goes wrong with a vehicle in a way that hurts someone, I would look at it and figure out what actually happened." "Like figuring out why something broke?" "Yeah, exactly like that." She ate a spoonful of cereal and thought about it. "So you're going to do that and also fix cars?" "Yeah." "At the same time?" "Different days," he said. "It won't change much about how things work." She appeared to accept this with the equanimity of a child whose fundamental concern is whether the daily rhythms that keep her world predictable are being preserved. "Will you still pick me up at 3:15? "Every day," he said. "Okay," she said. And that was that. He picked her up at 3:15 that afternoon, and every afternoon after it. The criminal proceedings against Marcus Hale moved the way Ray had said they would. Slowly, with the grinding institutional pace of a process designed to be thorough rather than fast. The formal indictment came down 6 weeks after the board meeting, on a Thursday in late November, on 7 counts including wire fraud, securities fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on his behalf, which surprised no one. The case was assigned to a federal judge and set on a timeline that the attorneys on both sides estimated would take a year to reach trial, possibly longer. The separate criminal investigation into the brake line modification developed more quietly, in the way of investigations that are building toward something specific. Reyes's contact at the criminal division confirmed to Ray, who confirmed to Ethan, that there was a named suspect, not Marcus Hale directly, but a man with prior connections to the kind of work that gets outsourced when the person who wants it done wants distance from it. The photograph Charlotte had included in the USB drive package. The image of a man crouching near the rear wheel well of the Bentley in the corporate parking structure had been matched against a private security contractor with a prior record. An arrest warrant was issued in early December. Victoria called Ethan the morning the warrant news broke. "They got him," she said. "I saw," Ethan said. He'd been in the middle of a valve cover gasket replacement on a Subaru when Ray had texted him. He'd finished the job and then sat in the bay for 10 minutes thinking about a Friday night and a woman handing him keys and the specific physics of a brake line failure at highway speed. "His connection to Marcus is being documented," Victoria said. "It's not ironclad yet. There's a layer of intermediary communication that the investigators are still untangling, but Reyes says it's there." She paused. "It'll be part of the conspiracy charges." "How do you feel about it?" he asked. A silence. "Complicated," she said. "I thought I'd feel more. When the arrest happened, more relief maybe. Instead, I just felt tired again." She paused. "And then I went to work and I had 3 meetings and I approved a capital allocation plan that I'm actually proud of. And by the end of the day, I felt okay." She sounded slightly surprised by her own account of this. "I think that's what getting through something looks like. Not a single moment, just a lot of days." "Yeah," Ethan said. "That's what it looks like." He started the consulting work in January. His first engagement was a review of the maintenance and inspection protocols for Sinclair Automotive Group's executive fleet, 42 vehicles, ranging from the Bentley down to a collection of company sedans used by regional managers. He spent 2 weeks on it, working 3 days at the shop and 2 days on the fleet review, and produced a 30-page report that identified 12 protocol gaps of varying severity, 3 of which were significant enough to require immediate remediation. Victoria read the report and called him. "This is good," she said. "It's honest," he said. "Some of it you're not going to like." "I already read it," she said. "I liked all of it, even the parts I didn't like." "That's the right response," he said. "It's the only sensible response," she said. "What's the point of having someone look at things carefully if you argue with what they see?" He thought about his father, who had argued constantly with mechanics who told him things he didn't want to hear, and about the 2 blown transmissions and 1 engine failure that had followed from those arguments. "More people should think that way," he said. "More people should think a lot of ways they don't," Victoria said. "But we work with what we have." The work settled into a rhythm over the following months. Not a dramatic one. Rhythms aren't dramatic, which is most of their value. Ethan ran the shop 3 days a week and took on fleet safety reviews for Sinclair's regional operations on the other 2, with occasional additional engagements when something specific came up. He hired a second full-time mechanic, a 28-year-old named Darius, who'd been working at one of the larger shops across town, and who had the particular combination of technical skill and genuine curiosity about problems that Ethan had learned to recognize and value. Darius was not easy to work with. He had strong opinions and stated them frequently. But he was honest, and he was good. And in Ethan's experience, those 2 things were worth more than easy. Ray called one afternoon in March. "I have something I need to talk to you about," Ray said. "Are you at the shop?" "Yeah." "I'll come by." Ray arrived 40 minutes later with coffee, which had become the established format of their interactions. He sat in the waiting area chair and looked at Ethan with the particular expression that Ethan had learned to recognize as the precursor to something that mattered. Federal investigators working the Marcus Hale case have been developing the full network of the financial scheme, Ray said, following the money, as they say. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. Some of what they've found connects to an older case, a corporate fraud inquiry from 5 years ago that was closed without full resolution. The primary subject died before charges could be filed, and the supporting evidence wasn't sufficient to pursue secondary actors. He looked at Ethan steadily. The secondary actors are now appearing in the Hale network. The same network, Ethan said. Different operation, different company, same underlying architecture, Ray said, and some of the same hands. He paused. The investigator running that older case has been pulled back in. She contacted me because your forensic work on the Hale documentation has been flagged as relevant. The methodology you used to trace the shell entity structures apparently matches a pattern she saw 5 years ago and couldn't fully document. Ethan was quiet for a moment. They want your help reopening it, Ray said. Outside, through the bay window, Ethan could see Darius working on a Honda Civic with the focused efficiency of someone who liked what he did. The shop smelled the same as it always smelled. The sign said what it was supposed to say. Maya's drawing from last week, a horse that looked more like a dog with ambitions, was taped to the edge of the desk in front of him. Tell me about the case, Ethan said. Ray told him. It took 20 minutes, and it was complicated, and some parts of it were ugly in the particular way of things that have been allowed to continue too long because the people with the power to stop them found it inconvenient to do so. When Ray finished, Ethan looked at the drawing on his desk, the horse dog with ambitions. Maya had told him it was running very fast to somewhere important and hadn't decided where yet. I'll need to look at the original documentation, Ethan said. The investigator is prepared to provide it, Ray said. And I'll need to be clear with Victoria that the consulting scope may expand in ways neither of us anticipated when we set it up. I think Victoria will be fine with that, Ray said dryly. I think so too, Ethan said, but I want to be straight with her about it. He called Victoria that evening after Maya was in bed. He stood in the backyard, the March air still cold enough to see his breath, the bicycle with the finally repaired tire leaning against the fence, the lights of the house warm and yellow behind him. He told her about Ray's visit, about the older case, about the request. She listened without interrupting, which was still, after months, something he appreciated about her. When he finished, she said, "You're going to do it." "If the scope fits," he said. "Ethan." Her voice was level, which was her version of dry. "You've been looking for this kind of work for years without admitting it to yourself. A mechanic doesn't build a forensic documentation methodology in his head during oil changes." He was quiet for a moment. "It's not just the technical part," she said. "You know that. It's the—" She paused, finding the word, "the being the honest one in the room. That's what you need. That's what you're good at. And that doesn't stop being useful after one case." "It doesn't," he said. "So do it," she said. "The fleet work will be here. I'm not going anywhere." A beat. Neither is the company, despite certain people's best efforts. He almost laughed. "Fair point." "It is," she said. "Call Ray." He stood in the backyard for a while after they hung up. The March night was wide and cold and clear, the sky doing what the Colorado sky did, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the particular way of things that don't need you to notice them to be what they are. He thought about what it was, exactly, that had happened between last October and now. Not the events of it. Those were clear enough. A car with sabotaged brakes, a USB drive, a lot of cold coffee and bad lighting and document work in a small shop, a board meeting, a federal freeze on $4.3 million, a man arrested, a woman who hadn't died, and a company that was still standing, and a case that was still being built toward whatever justice the machinery of institutions could produce, which was imperfect and slow and real. But underneath the events, there was something else, something harder to name. He'd spent 5 years building a life structured entirely around being present. For Maya, for the shop, for the daily accumulation of small, reliable things that kept everything stable. And that had been right. It had been necessary, and it had been right, and he didn't regret any of it. Stability isn't nothing. Showing up every day is not a small thing. The world runs on people who show up, who do the quiet, necessary work, who fix what's in front of them without requiring it to be more than it is. But there's a version of that life that tips over into smallness, where you stop expecting things from yourself beyond the immediate and the manageable, where you stop using the full range of what you actually are. He hadn't realized how close he'd gotten to that until a black Bentley rolled into his lot on a Friday night and asked him to look at something more complicated than he'd been expecting. The thing about being the honest one in the room, the thing Victoria had named and that he'd understood but not quite said out loud yet, was that it required you to be honest with yourself first, about what you were capable of, about what you owed to the particular skills you happened to have been given and to have developed, about the difference between being practical and being diminished. He was 32. Maya was 7. She was going to be 17 in 10 years and 27 in 20, and she was going to look at him the way children look at their parents when they're old enough to see them as people, as actual particular human beings with histories and choices and roads not taken. And he wanted what she saw to be someone who had done the full thing, not just survived. Done it. He went inside. Maya had left her library book on the kitchen table, which was a violation of the agreement they'd reached after the under-the-couch incident, but he didn't say anything about it. He just moved it to the counter where she'd see it in the morning and remembered to take it. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. He called Ray in the morning. 6 months later, on a Thursday afternoon in September, Ethan was in his office doing invoices, still the part of the job he liked least, still something he was marginally better at than he'd been a year ago, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, then answered. A woman identified herself as a senior investigator with a federal corporate fraud division, not Reyes's division, a different one, based in Chicago. She said his name had been provided as a forensic documentation specialist with specific expertise in corporate vehicle fleet safety and financial fraud correlation. She said she had a case she'd like to discuss. He leaned back in his chair. Through the window, he could see Darius in Bay 1, working on a transmission, talking to himself the way he did when he was focused. The sign outside was functioning. The afternoon light was doing what September afternoon light did, warm and slightly golden and pointing toward the end of things in a way that didn't feel like an ending. "Tell me about the case," Ethan said. She told him. He listened. He asked 3 questions, which told him more than her description had. The third answer told him this was real work, the kind that mattered, the kind that needed someone who would look carefully and report honestly regardless of what the honest report cost anyone. "I can take a look," he said. "Send me what you have." After he hung up, he sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a decision already made. Not a big moment. Not a dramatic one. Just a man in a small office in a repair shop in Colorado with a daughter who was 7 and would be 8 in 6 weeks, and had already informed him that the birthday party theme was going to involve horses. Real ones, if possible. Painted ones on everything, if not. And a company that trusted him to tell the truth about their machines. And a set of skills that had been waiting in a drawer for longer than they should have been. Just a man deciding, again, to use what he had. He saved the invoices, put his jacket on, and went out into the bay to help Darius with the transmission. It was, all things considered, a good afternoon to work.